Hey everyone, and welcome to Generative Now. I am Michael Mignano, and I'm a partner at Lightspeed. This week, I'm talking with someone who sits at the crossroads of economics, innovation, and the future of AI governance, Sam Hammond. Sam is the chief economist at the Foundation for American Innovation, where he's tackling some of the thorniest questions of our time. How do we govern AI? How do we future-proof our institutions? And how do we make sure American innovation doesn't get lost in bureaucracy? We talk about where AI is going, how the governments are thinking about regulating this new technology, and where AI policy might be headed in the near future. Let's get into it. Sam, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thanks for doing this. Got a lot of questions for you. Want to get into all things AI and policy. Before we do that, I think it'd be great for the audience to know a little bit about you and your background in your own words. So
Sure.
Tell us about Sam.
I'm currently chief economist at the Foundation for American Innovation, FAI, 10-year-old organization founded by a couple guys in a YC batch in 2014 that wanted to build a bridge between the cultures of Silicon Valley and DC. We do work now in policy at the intersection of national security, governance, and emerging technology. As our chief economist, I lead our AI policy work that includes working on national security issues like export controls, frontier model regulation. But then we also host a conservative AI policy fellowship to try to build some talent on the right for AI policy.
I've heard you describe yourself as a technologist and a policy wonk. You told us sort of how FAI got started. What, I guess, drew you to the intersection of tech policy and ultimately FAI?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in rural Nova Scotia in the fishing community and was raised on the internet. So I'm very into philosophy, cognitive science, ended up fascinated by American politics, as many Canadians are. We're all kind of America watchers. I suppose my interest in AI kicked off with reading Ray Kurzweil back in, I think, 2004. I read his 99 book, Age of Spiritual Machines, and that's where he lays out the 2029 forecast for AI's passing a Turing test. And that has always sort of stuck in the back of my mind. And my academic interests steered more towards sort of political science, political philosophy, how institutions evolved in light of the Industrial Revolution. And so I've sort of brought that perspective in how I think about AI. If this is as transformative as the Industrial Revolution or the printing press or these other major technological paradigm shifts, then what does that mean for our institutions going forward? It seems to suggest that there's going to be much more radical, not just change on the technology level or the economic level or the output level, but like what institutions do we need to keep up with that pace of change?
So you briefly mentioned some of the issues and the areas you spent a lot of time thinking about at FAI in the beginning of the conversation. I guess, talk to us about some of the ones, especially now, that you're most focused on in terms of AI issues or policy debates that you think are going to be the most important to AI.
Sure. I mean, there are only a handful of key inputs or ingredients that go into competing at the frontier. It's things like data, better algorithms, the talent, having world-class software engineers, ML engineers, but then also energy. To your original question about what are the big policy things, it really cashes out to energy and chips. Mm-hmm. So on the energy front, doing everything we can to build domestic energy capacity, especially electrical, low intermittency energy, because when you're running these data centers, you made this sometimes multi-billion dollar investment, mostly going towards GPUs. Yeah. To recoup that investment, you want those GPUs running 24/7 for training, for inference, for renting them out, whatever. And so that requires having persistent baseload, non-intermittent sources of energy, which the U.S. has a lot of latent potential for, right? Out in the in the plains and in the Pacific Northwest, there's lots of potential geothermal. You're seeing more interest around rebooting decommissioned nuclear facilities or leaning into SMRs and these more cutting edge nuclear reactors, potentially even solar. But just the fact of the matter is, while we've added lots of renewables to the grid, we've taken off equal proportions of coal and fossil fuels. And so we have basically added nothing to the grid net. You extrapolate out to 2030, unless we add something. I think globally, data centers are adding about 100 gigawatts to global energy demand. The US wants to be at least half of that. So we need to go full tilt on energy production, permitting, and all the other bottlenecks that stand in the way. And on the chip front, ensuring that we maintain our lead, whether that's through, investing in R&D to make sure that we stay ahead of the curve in new kinds of silicon.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So I guess when you think about the ingredients and maybe with a special focus on the hardware, given your point that that's probably where our advantage lies today, ours being the US, I guess like what role do you think governments should play in sort of guiding both the development and really like, I guess, the defensibility of these four ingredients here in the US?
Yeah. So, energy, as I already mentioned, huge and probably, over the medium to long term, the bottleneck.
Yep.
Investing in export control capacity for enforcement. So, that is done out of the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is tasked with this, equally, in my view, important mission, but something that's requires a technical depth because the semiconductor supply chain is the most complex supply chain in human history. And, they have maybe 50 enforcement officers, 50 to 100 is in their budget's around 50 to 100 million. There were in 2024, 3 smuggling cases that the estimated profit that those smugglers were making off of smuggling chips was 2.5 times BIS's entire enforcement budget. So I've been working on this bill called the Chip Security Act, which would require ping-based location verification for exported chips. And there's also another bill called the Stop Stealing Our Chips Act, which would create a whistleblower program at BIS modeled on the SEC program for white collar crime, where if you're, a guy in Malaysia and you catch wind that there's chips being smuggled, you could potentially win a portion of the resulting fine. So basically efforts to make these things scalable.
Yeah. And
then stepping back, the other potential sort of, I would say, like tail risks to AI in the US are things like, a bad copyright ruling, right? Right now.
Explain that.
Well, right now, imagine like the meme of like all of the economy standing, being balanced on fair use. So under US copyright law, fair use describes a doctrine that says you can use copyrighted materials if it's transformative in some way. And that's can be a very subjective, so is someone on YouTube reacting to this podcast right now where they just have like their little face in the corner? Is that transformative? Probably. And for the most part, that's why there's so many React videos on YouTube. But like, if they just stood there in silence and didn't add any actual value, is that transformative? Then you get into these gray areas. So the big question for AI is training data.
Right. You mentioned one of the ingredients, right? Data.
Right. Exactly. And so the argument has been, and I think there's actually a recent case involving Anthropic where they prevailed on this argument that actually, yes, training on copyrighted data is protected by fair use. What's not protected is like if you'd go to an image model and say make a Italian plumber with a mustache and it spits out Mario, right? Like the outputs, how you use these models, and these models do end up memorizing a lot of their training data. And so if you're the New York Times and you put a lot of effort into like getting it to regurgitate an article, you can succeed at that. In some sense, you have to know what the contents of the article is already before you can actually do that. But otherwise, the way the courts have so far interpreted it, and I think the way the labs interpret this, is that, training on copyright data is not that different than like an artist listening to music and getting inspired. What matters is how that gets transformed in the context of a neural network to like interpolate and extrapolate between those different styles and things of that nature to produce something genuinely novel.
Right. So you mentioned like, a bad copyright ruling, I think is how you phrased it, could drive some of the policy making and regulation around AI. Is that what you mean? Or
yeah, I mean a lot of just policy in general in the United States is determined by the courts. Right. It might be a negative ruling on fair use. The OpenAI New York Times case, there's one of the arguments that's been made is that OpenAI is obligated to preserve all their users' chat log that has its own, weird implications. Like, imagine, the privacy concerns if you have to store all that data. And there's open questions around like, okay, so as these models get implemented in the real economy, maybe you're using it to cheat at your homework. And so the teacher should be able to like somehow see that, but maybe you're using it as a therapist, and, a real therapist has a kind of privileged relationship with their client. But like, if this data can just be, discovered in court or something like that, these are just giant open questions.
So energy, training data, practices, fair use. What are some of the other areas where policy may play a big role?
There's lots. I mean, and this is what's coming up in Congress. It's just everyone realizing that like everything is an AI role.
Right.
Right. And so like big open questions about what to do around like workforce development, retraining.
Right. Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any good answers on that so far.
Yeah.
What to do for sort of enabling regulation. We've seen many jurisdictions roll out Waymo and now Tesla's in Austin, fully autonomous self-driving cars. But to like really get the full vision of full autonomy, maybe the Department of Transportation needs to have some kind of framework, an enabling framework. And you can imagine similar sort of enabling frameworks for drones, for anything that interacts in the real world, or like crosses state lines, that sort of thing. AI for science. So, there's different pieces to this. You can imagine, I think there's already been studies showing that frontier AIs write better peer reviews than the actual scientists. You could say, well, maybe the scientist should be like, maybe the process should be that your journal article goes through the AI peer review first, and then like the peer reviewers check it. There's all kinds of ways you could see the process changing. The question is, will our institutions like adapt and co-evolve and like embrace the technology and potentially use it to like accelerate the pace of scientific grant making and that sort of thing. And then so that's the institutional side. And there's on the AI for science per se side where, there's proposals and people working on ideas around like self-driving labs. Could you have a AI scientist that is continuously generating hypotheses, running experiments, and actually connected to, a laboratory where it has a petri dish and so on? What could that potentially unlock? And is there a role for the national labs, the Department of Energy, to enable some of that, maybe by, through their facilities or potentially through unlocking federal data sets? Right. DOE probably has the world's most comprehensive data set on like chemistry, material science.
Right.
A lot of that data has strange data sharing agreements and permissions. And so, there's all kinds of work that needs to be done.
I want to better understand from you, like how sort of policymaking and lawmaking actually will like in practice impact all this stuff. But maybe like first zooming out, just like, what do you feel is at stake here?
There's sort of what you could think of as the more like pessimistic world for AI. Not that AI goes bad, but like that the technology sort of hits some walls or plateaus. It's a really important technology, but it's maybe like the internet or something like that. And so the upshot of maintaining a lead means that when we cross these sort of thresholds where we can have like large chunks of the economy become driven by AI, fully automated factories, advanced R&D, that this will produce a growth dividend, right? Even under pessimistic scenarios, like a major increase to productivity growth. Then there's like the more, you could say, more aggressive scenario where like we are about to cross over thresholds of AI capability where, it's not just AI giving people an uplift in their job or giving a productivity dividend, but we have like AI agents that can work for 8 hours or a week or a month at a time, uninterrupted, potentially able to run thousands or millions of those in parallel, including applied to the AI R&D enterprise itself, potentially unlocking a recursive self-improvement loop where we pull ahead dramatically, where even if we have a 6-month lead over our next competitor, that 6 months is sort of telescoping in progress and compressing the pace of progress, where that 6 months makes all the difference.
So 6 months makes all the difference, or it could make all the difference. Like, then I guess let's talk about sort of mapping this notion of like time being an important factor to lawmaking and regulation. I guess like talk to us about that tension. I mean, with the technology this important, it feels like there's going to be regulation. How do you view the importance of that regulation, or do you feel like there shouldn't be? And how do you square that with the race to maintain this competitive advantage?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different elements to this.
Yeah.
On the permitting side, for instance, permitting just to get the environmental reviews complete for a high voltage DC transmission line, is 7 years. And there are some transmission line projects that take 30 years.
Right.
And so when we're talking about adding, tens to hundreds of gigawatts to the grid by 2030, we need the power lines to come up a lot faster than that. And so, and so this time pressure is really coming to bear in a way that it hasn't in the past. And that's leaning towards, taking more emergency measures. Can we like leverage national security provisions in various environmental laws to expedite the process, things of that nature? Can we lean into behind the meter energy production where you don't even need to connect to the grid, but there are certain advantages on the permitting side? Then there's this broader perspective, which is like, AI is going to affect everything, right? And so, when AI comes for drug discovery, we're going to need we can't just give FDA officials like AI co-pilots. We're going to like rethink the drug approval process.
Right.
And same with like transportation and all these other areas. And so most of the stuff is in statute. Right. There's limited things you can do. You can, maybe do a pilot program at FDA, but like to really change the process, you're going to need Congress to step up and act and have a sort of burst of legislative productivity that we haven't seen since like the New Deal era.
So what actually happens? Like, what do you do? Again, when time, you just mentioned like 6 months could make the difference.
Yeah. So this may be the ultimate bottleneck is, I lived in DC during COVID and it was striking how, early a lot of technologists were to the pandemic, right? I remember like Balaji Srinivasan on Twitter with his famous going viral thread in January, where he said, this could be the one, right? And you talk to normal people, normies, they'd say, well, it's like 17 people in Italy. I'm not that worried, but they just didn't understand that exponential. And I think we're in a sort of similar space with AI, where it started to change even in the last 6 months, but the degree of sort of common knowledge, but the urgency among members of Congress and just policymakers more generally is still sort of in that January 2020 phase, where there are people who are early and see where it's going and are trying to raise alarm bells. But a lot of people are like, in my own experience during that January 2020, I talked to people like, are we going to do anything about this pandemic? And they say, there's the NDA reauthorization is up. We don't have any room in the calendar. We're never going to get to it. And I remember March 12th, 14th, whatever it was, when the NBA season was canceled. Yeah. Tom Hanks got COVID. The WHO declared a global pandemic. 2 weeks later, we passed the CARES Act, which was this $2.2 trillion pandemic response bill. So like when Congress,
they can move fast. They can mobilize.
When there's a crisis, Congress can move quickly.
Yeah.
The question is, will they do it smartly?
What do you foresee? Like, what's a potential crisis, like with respect to AI, that could mobilize Congress in like that sort of time frame?
We're talking about like inching our way towards artificial general intelligence, and the point of AGI is the generality, and that makes it very difficult to talk about, because when you have a very intelligent general system, it affects everything, right? And we have, I think you could argue that we already have sort of baby AGIs with the frontier models. What they lack is like autonomy. Yeah. Right. And autonomy is going to be this massive unlock that we're just starting to see with reasoning models. And now you have the meter research showing that the task horizon length that these models can perform at is doubling roughly every 4 to 7 months. So, if today they can do a 30-minute tasks, 30-minute long task, and in 4 to 7 months, they'll do an hour-long task in 2 hours and 4 hours and 8 hours. And so, pretty quickly, we're looking at systems that will be able to perform, continuous, reliable work for weeks, potentially months at a time. And that, I think, will be a wake-up call, because that autonomy will, manifest in various different ways. It will manifest in, potential, cyber vulnerabilities, right? It's one thing to say that, hackers in Moldova are using Cursor to like give them a boost. It's another thing if like anyone anywhere with some GPUs can launch thousands or tens of thousands of phishing attacks of, agents that are patiently waiting contributing to the repo, to waiting for the right moment to strike.
But in theory, like, wouldn't something like that type of disruption actually mobilize lawmakers to probably restrict AI development? Like it almost feels like, if you compare it to the COVID example, it would probably have like almost like a deceleration effect.
Yeah, I think that another commonality of COVID is it's sort of like, once it's out of the lab, it's out of the lab.
Yeah.
And, there is this, given the declining cost of compute, given algorithmic and hardware improvements, models that today cost $1 billion to train, in a few years' time will cost, $10 million to train. And so there is going to be this diffusion of capabilities, including through open source, that mean there is no real slowing down path. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that regulation does try to slow down the frontier, it's going to be slowing down the good guys, the labs that actually have oversight, that are policing misuse through their APIs and that sort of thing.
And so who are the bad guys?
The bad guys are there's misuse, right? So, but also just like, you can imagine once we have very powerful AI agents that can do computer use and long-term planning and that sort of thing, that you have a disgruntled ex-boyfriend who wants to create the, malware bot that once it's released and self-replicating is like permanently terrorizing his ex-girlfriend.
Right.
Sending her Domino's pizza. She moves, she like posts on Instagram that uses its, geo-guessing abilities to guess her new location.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a kind of genie that releases out of the bottle that like we will likely adapt to, but that adaptation will generate, we won't be able to adapt without also deploying AI tools on the other side, right?
Yeah.
To detect whether the user on the social media site is a real person or not. And so the dual use nature of AI means that we can't afford to slow down, because it's sort of, we need even better AI to defeat the bad guys.
What are some other examples of where you foresee sort of like the ground truth of what's happening with AI and development, and maybe some of the industries that are affected by it, compared to, where lawmaking may not keep up? Like where is there going to be like another collision or mismatch?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's going to keep up in any of these places. Right? Yeah. This is one of my worries is, during COVID, when FDA was like still walking the vaccines, there was lots of calls to do like right to try at the state level. Some points to states have started asking, does the FDA have authority over us, or can we just like approve this drug immediately so we can get it out of our homes? And so if there's like this rapid progress that like our institutions are failing to keep up with, I think there will be a tendency for things to sort of find the weakest link, and the water will flow, to jurisdictions that don't have similar bottlenecks through just people sort of nullifying what the rules say. So when it comes to Congress, I do worry, to your point, that the immediate response will be kind of reactionary in the sense of
this is like a disruption. So is the idea and the position, I guess, then about AI, it's like no regulation, completely hands off, like let this technology accelerate.
I mean, we want to go faster.
Okay.
We want to build lots of energy. The acceleration deceleration dichotomy misses the ways in which technology is not a linear process.
Mm-hmm.
There are different kind of branching paths we could go down. There's, I think, a strong case for a more defensive accelerationist point of view, where like we want to pull forward the AIs that can detect zero-day exploits in our code bases before we have the AIs that can exploit those code bases. And some of that may be, require differential access on the part of the labs. If OpenAI develops some really radically more capable model, let the national security actors know in advance so they can actually both have like some foresight, but then also, brace for impact, so to speak. And then I also support broadly, like, standard setting from the newly formed CASE, which is formerly the AI Safety Institute, voluntary standards, transparency. I think there's some prerogative on labs to actually share their information, including with each other, so that they sort of know where the state of the art is.
What types of information? Model weights or?
No, not necessarily IP, but like, incident reporting.
Okay.
If they stumble on some, new alignment technique. Then I think also like, these data centers are going to become increasingly sort of critical infrastructure and assets, and both for national security purposes, but also like imagine we roll the clock forward 10 years and like a large cross section of knowledge work is being performed in data centers. That's a single point of failure. If you do a cyber attack, it's not just it's not just turning off the lights. It's like turning off a third of your economy. You want those things to be heavily fortified. And I think you could argue there are market failures right now where data center developers, they do some infrastructure security, but they're not like putting up the fixed costs to like be defended against like nation state actors.
Right. What about maybe just a couple other specific examples I'd love to get your take on? Like what about fair use? You mentioned that this is a big topic for training data. Like, how do you see that landscape playing out? And I guess where does FAI stand on sort of policy making in that area?
Yeah, I should have said at the outset, the FAI, we don't have a one voice policy. So we have broad sort of values and principles, with the builder ethos and so on. But on copyright, I think we're mostly all aligned that, so far the courts have held up fair use. But if that was ever in jeopardy, like I would like to see like an affirmative policy or for lawmakers to just put in the statute that, training data is completely fair use, because we see abroad in the EU with their copyright directive, but even like countries like Canada or Australia that just have like modestly less permissive copyright, that it is a wet blanket on developers.
Well, what would happen, I guess, if there was a different type of ruling and maybe lawmakers were like slow to respond to this?
Yeah, then suddenly, data collection halts. You could even see, injunctions that force models offline. Of course.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
like force OpenAI to shut down.
I mean, in principle, if like the models that they're serving are trained on data that they don't have rightful access to, there'll still be open models, right?
Yeah.
But fines, massive fines. Some of these cases are talking about like every article that you trained on from this news service is $100,000 or something like that. And so, those add up when you're talking about trillions of tokens.
Yeah. But you're saying the current take is that, and you said, I think you said there have been some recent cases. The current determination from courts, I guess, not lawmakers, is that this is fair use, but that could change. What about AI-induced labor disruptions? Like, how do you square this? As you mentioned, the cat's out of the bag, but there, I think the belief is there will be labor disruptions. Is the idea that like you just let that happen, or there should be some policy or regulation to sort of ease us into this new world? Like, I don't know. I'm curious how you think about that from a regulation standpoint.
Yeah. So before I joined FAI, I used to be director of social policy at a think tank called the Niskanen Center. I was there from 2016 up through 2023. And my prerogative there, even though I'd come from a tech policy background, was to think about, what social insurance and other sort of complementary institutions are needed to facilitate creative destruction, so you don't get these like perennial backlashes. And so we worked a lot on like child tax credits, income support programs, unemployment insurance reform, workforce and retraining. And I got a sort of a crash course in just how backwards and convoluted these systems are. Right. So like going back to another COVID example, remember went into lockdown and quarantine, businesses shut down around the country.
Sure.
There were lineups around the block to claim unemployment insurance.
Sure.
Some of these unemployment insurance offices in different states, well, most of them run on like COBOL or Fortran mainframes. Most of the people who can actually code that have retired.
Yeah.
Some of them had websites that were only active during business hours. And so, that was a massive, cluster, and so you don't want to see a repeat of that. I don't expect the labor market disruption to be as like sharp.
Right. Because there wouldn't be just like one day there's a lockdown, one day there isn't a lockdown, and then one day there is a lockdown.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there are other solitary aspects to the way AI is diffusing where, before it completely automates a job, there's like this on-ramp where it's actually augmenting people's work, and maybe you want to hire more software engineers because they can do proportionally more work. There's also the extensive margin. So maybe using an AI coding assistant makes you 10% or 20% more productive, but for the person who doesn't code at all, it takes them from like 0 to infinity. Right? Yeah. And you are seeing like this on the extensive margin, way more people being able to code to produce apps, and that doesn't crowd out anyone's job. And in some sense, we're at peak software engineer at the same time as we're seeing like everyone become a software engineer. And then the other aspect of this is it's much more, the impacts are much more up and down the income distribution. So it's one thing if you were a furniture factory worker in North Carolina and then your job got offshored and you were 55 years old and had no other skills. You didn't want to go work at Walmart this meeting, so you fell back on social security disability insurance or just retired early. Those geographically concentrated sort of skill specific labor shocks can be devastating to communities. But when you have shocks that are happening, horizontally across the whole economy, you don't have as much geographical concentration. And you also have the potential that, there is a tailwind of new opportunities are moving in behind. And particularly for knowledge workers, like, they may be first on the chopping block, but we are all, I consider myself a knowledge worker. We're also some of the most adaptable and able to learn these new tools quickly. Fortunately, like the AI tooling itself is like lowering the barrier to entry to acquire new skills. I don't foresee a world of like mass technological unemployment, at least in the near term. And if that world did transpire, I don't think it would look like we're all sitting around a UBI. I think it would look like we've moved into like a new, economic system, like post-capitalism. We're back to like hunter-gatherer gift economy or something.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that
given it would be more gradual, like it sounds like you don't think there should be any sort of policy making around this.
No. It's just such a thorny, complex issue. Yeah. So, the unemployment insurance program is from like 1935.
Yeah.
These COBOL mainframes I mentioned were built under the Kennedy administration. And these things are kind of
We need
static.
upgrades, basically.
We need massive technological upgrades. I think also, honestly, we need to greenfield new kinds of programs, job seeker allowances, for instance. Right now, if you lose your job and are eligible for unemployment insurance, you get a small fraction of what used to be paid. Other countries have things like job seekers allowances where they will pay you to basically go job hunting, and in some cases like do subsidized employment where like they'll pay part of your salary. So a job hires you, does on the job retraining. I think we need more experimentation in those areas.
I know there are many people out there that think, sort of labor disruptions maybe more severe than you're talking about, maybe less severe. Where do you think Congress is and policymakers? Like, do you think they're overestimating or underestimating what's about to happen?
I mean, everyone is underestimating.
Underestimating.
Yeah, even the more we could say like AGI pilled members of Congress, and there are a handful.
Oh wow. Okay.
Are still not fully, seeing all the full implications. I think back to 2023 when Sam Altman testified about, our goal is to build superintelligence, and, this poses existential risks to humanity. And then Senator Marshall Blackburn from Tennessee asked, what does that mean for music royalties, right? And if you're building superintelligence, music royalties would not be like my focus, but that's because Nashville is obviously
got it.
And so Congress people are all attuned to their constituencies. You've seen this with like the role of like SAG-AFTRA, the Screen Actors Guild, behind many of these AI regulations. I think there's room for smart AI regulation, but it's not going to come from a place of like, let's nail down what's ours. It's going to come from a place of skating to where the puck is going, and trying to facilitate a smoother transition rather than think we can kind of preserve a status quo.
And even if I draw, maybe it's not a perfect straight line to your example earlier around sort of like concentrated geographic areas or skills versus a more horizontal impact. Like we should probably take a similar approach to regulation, things that are more horizontal rather than just trying to whack a mole for every specific issue.
Yes and no. I think there's some of the deeper AI risks, like around like CBRN, cyber, bio, radiological, nuclear risks. I think we do need to sort of gerrymander, if you will, some restrictions on can you open source your bioweapon model? There's one thing if you're building like a drug discovery platform, but the labs are investigating this thoroughly and make sure that their models have safeguards in place and things along those lines. So I would say that those are sort of the discrete vertical forms of risk. But then yes, on the horizontal level, I think for the most part, the best thing we can do is to take a broadly deregulatory approach. There's this worry around like, will AI laws at the state level create a patchwork, and I think that it could be an issue, but I think what it misses is the extent to which the real laws that are slowing down AI deployment are all the legacy laws around all the other industries, right? The laws about like in healthcare, finance, education, transportation, like these laws are all written and structured for the pre-AI era, and when the mode of production, when the general purpose technology is shifting beneath your feet, it's less that the regulation is more or less, that we need more or less. It's more that it loses its direction of fit. Like the basic ontology of the thing you're regulating is changing.
Right.
And you almost need to do like a kind of regulatory jubilee to like reset.
You mentioned state level regulation. Tell us a little bit about the moratorium on state level regulation.
Sure.
Yeah.
As we're recording this, the moratorium, which is a proposal to basically prohibit state level AI regulation. There's some carve-out exemptions for 10 years. When this was originally introduced, it was very controversial. It's being embedded in the reconciliation bill, so the big tax reform. And the way reconciliation works, which is this arcane budgetary process, is you can pass this bill with 50+1 votes if and only if it's all budgetary, fiscally related. And so you technically can't make like regulatory changes unless you've tied it to something fiscal. And so as we speak, there's a new version of the moratorium released by Senator Ted Cruz that ties it to receipts of the BEAD program money, the broadband money for rural broadband. And so the idea would be, if this passes, that states face a choice. They are either restricted from passing new AI regulation, or they can give up their money for rural broadband. And this is how a lot of things get implemented. Like, I think, the seatbelt laws are imposed federally, only because
They were attached.
they're attached to transportation infrastructure money.
Fair.
So it's an oddity of the American system. But the bigger debate is 10 years, an eternity in AI, and we don't really even know what AI regulation looks like in 10 years. If AI starts to eat like large fractions of the economy, like AI regulation may just be like regulating your local economy. And so, I'm a bit ambivalent on it. I understand the argument that, we don't want to see a patchwork. There were over 1,000 state laws proposed last session. Many of these could add, substantial burdens to developers, especially smaller developers that would struggle to compete. And my wish would be like there would be a more narrowly scoped version of this that was aimed at preempting the forms of regulation that would actually hurt AI development and not cast such a broad net. Maybe be a bit shorter. But honestly, I can see the argument both ways.
That makes sense.
How do you think the U.S.
should be working with other countries with respect to AI? And I guess more broadly, like, do you feel like sort of multilateral cooperation on AI safety globally is even possible?
Yeah, I think I'm an optimist here. If you take like the misalignment arguments seriously, and I don't think we should discount them, then it's not in no one's interest to build some rogue AI.
Yeah.
Right. And I think like even in the best case scenarios, it's going to be destabilizing.
Yeah.
Not maybe the labor market turns out well and so forth, but like just to our institutions. People don't like change, and I'm a big fan of change. Like I fundamentally believe in dynamism, but it can be like really raw and disturbing. I think back to like when Uber and Lyft began displacing taxi cabs. That was a kind of regime change for the taxi commissions, for the medallion holders and so on. And for everyone else, like there was just this massive leapfrog in like the quality of like your life. You could just hail a car, not have to haggle over anything. But for the taxi drivers, like they were throwing rocks off bridges in Paris. It was like very traumatic. And so I think that we do need to have a kind of like trepidation or some sense of realism that this is going to be a very rocky period, even in the best of possible worlds.
Yeah.
And go into these things of that sort of mindset, a security mindset, because there are going to be very hard choices that get made, and maybe set like initial conditions that affect the development of AI going forward.
If I was the founder of an AI company that was just getting off the ground today, what advice would you give me with respect to how I should be thinking about AI policy and how it may change over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think there's probably going to be room for AI companies and startups in general to like build sort of forms of civic tech that respond to these policy demands in a way that's faster than policymakers can, and then use that as an opportunity to build some like good faith, to demo what's possible, that sort of thing. So like, could you imagine, a retraining system built on like custom AI framework or something like that is just light years ahead of like any Department of Labor program, right? So try to work backwards from like potential social problems and actually try to build solutions for them. Because I think
super interesting.
I think tech will be just like vastly more scalable and more responsive, in part because it'll be integrating AI and solve this sort of the differential arms race between the diffusion in the public and private sector.
And then looking forward, what are you most optimistic about when it comes to advancements in AI or policy?
On the tech side, I have what they say is like very short timelines. So I think we're going to get very powerful systems within the next handful of years. I sort of think there's no way up but through, and so I think I'm just like whether it should be. I'm more of a realist than an optimist, but like I'm also just like incredibly excited and like kind of grateful to be born in this time period to participate in this transition. I'm obviously excited about like massive dividend to productivity and GDP growth, to new treatments for disease, potentially solutions to longevity. We're going to have radical splendor that like looks increasingly sci-fi over time. On the policy front, so I think we're off to the races, and especially the energy projects that are being unveiled. There was a couple executive orders, one around the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, so the NRC, which licenses new nuclear reactors, has never licensed a new nuclear reactor in its history. They're doing a massive overhaul of that. We're going to see SMRs, spreading up around the country, and just more broadly, like the Overton window has opened up, where like the administration is taking big swings at things that were on no one's radar. Right. So like back in the day, I used to work on supersonic flight, and I wrote a paper in 2016 called "Make America Boom Again," which was about why the Concorde, after the Concorde retired, we didn't get supersonic, and it all goes back to this 1973 regulation by the FAA that prohibited supersonic over land. It's a classic like seen and unseen. Like no one knows about this like single line in the code of regulations, but it killed off that industry, which would naturally have emerged for business jets and things that fly over land. Now we have Boom Supersonic, which I'm a big fan of, and they've demoed. Their test flight showed that they could actually fly with no boom because of the certain altitude the boom actually reflects. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration signed an executive order ordering the FAA to repeal the ban on supersonic. Wow. So there's just like so much happening behind the scenes that's like unlocking all the tech all the parts of the tech tree that we like inadvertently shut down since the 70s. And as that sort of like synthesizes with AI, we're going to see like just incredible new technologies come to the market.
Awesome. Sam, thank you so much for doing this.
No, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Generative Now. If you liked this episode, please rate and review the show. And of course, subscribe. It really does help. And if you want to learn more, follow Lightspeed at LightspeedVP on X, YouTube, or LinkedIn. Generative Now is produced by Lightspeed in partnership with Pod People. I am Michael Mignano, and we will be back next week. See you then.